Mira hadn't always been the woman they spat at in the market square. There was a time, not long ago, when she'd been someone's daughter, someone's hope, someone's reason for a small feast every harvest. That girl was gone now. What remained was the one the pack called barren, worthless, a waste of good blood. She'd stopped flinching at the words months ago. Mostly, the morning started like any other. Cold stone under her bare feet, the smell of burnt porridge drifting from the kitchens, old Hessa barking at her to hurry with the laundry before the rain came in. Mira moved fast, arms full of wet linen, when she heard them 3 women near the well, not even bothering to lower their voices. That's her, the one who couldn't give Tomas a child in 4 years. 4 years married, and nothing. No wonder he left her for someone useful. Cursed womb, my mother says. Some women just aren't meant to carry life. Mira kept walking. She'd learned the fastest way through cruelty was straight through it head down, feet moving, don't look back. But her chest still tightened every time, like a fist slowly closing around her ribs. She reached the drying line behind the servants' quarters and started pinning sheets, fingers numb from cold water. A gust of wind tugged one corner loose, and she swore under her breath, chasing the fabric before it hit the mud. Need help with that? She turned, startled. It was Bren, one of the stable hands, the only person in this whole place who still talked to her like a person instead of a cautionary tale. I've got it, she said, though her arms were shaking from the cold. Bren grabbed the other end anyway. You know they're talking again. About the king. Her stomach dropped, though she tried not to show it. What about him? Looking for a new mate? Council's pushing this time, hard. They've already lined up candidates from the noble houses. Bren shrugged, pinning the sheet with quick hands. Strong bloodlines. Proven fertility. You know how it goes. I know how it goes, Mira repeated. Flat. She did know. Everyone did. King Alaric Voss had buried his first wife 2 years back, and ever since, the kingdom had been holding its breath waiting for him to choose again. An alpha king without an heir was a kingdom standing on cracked ice, and the council reminded him of it constantly in meetings, at feasts, in every quiet corner they could trap him in. It had nothing to do with her. It never would. A king needed a queen who could give him sons and daughters, a future. Mira couldn't even give that to her own husband, and he hadn't been royalty. She'd accepted long ago that whatever life had left for her wasn't going to involve castles. It was going to involve laundry, porridge, and the occasional kindness from a stable boy who felt sorry for her. So when Hessa called her name across the courtyard that afternoon, voice sharp with panic, Mira assumed someone had broken a vase or spilled wine on the good carpets again. West Wing, Hessa said, breathless. They need water and cloths. Now, don't ask, just go. Mira didn't ask. She filled the basin fast and hurried through corridors she rarely had reason to walk. Servants like her weren't usually allowed past the second archway. She found the room by the noise-raised voices, a child crying, someone barking orders. She pushed the door open, and the first thing she saw was blood. Not much, but enough to spike her pulse. A boy, maybe 6, sat on a low bench, his arm wrapped in a torn shirt, tears cutting through the dust on his face. Healer's been sent for, a guard near the door said, sounding more panicked than the situation called for. Not coming fast enough. Mira didn't wait for permission. She knelt in front of the boy. Hey, look at me. His eyes, wide and wet, found hers. What's your name? Theo, he hiccuped. Okay, Theo. I'm Mira. I need to look at your arm. I'll be quick, promise. He nodded, shaking. She unwrapped the shirt carefully, and relief hit almost instantly. The cut was deep but clean. She'd treated worse on the farm, back when she still had a farm to call her own. This is going to sting a little, she warned, pressing a damp cloth against the wound. Theo hissed but held still, gripping her sleeve like it was the only solid thing in the room. "You're doing great," she murmured. "Braver than half the men I've met." A shaky laugh escaped him. She worked fast, cleaning and wrapping with strips torn from her own apron, since the proper bandages were nowhere in sight. By the time she finished, Theo's breathing had slowed, and the panic in the room had settled into exhausted relief. Only then did she notice him. He stood near the window, arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle. Tall, broad enough to fill the doorway behind him, dark hair like he'd been dragging his hands through it for an hour. She didn't need anyone to say his name. The crest on his collar said enough. King Alaric Voss. Mira's whole body went stiff. She stood too fast, nearly knocking the basin over. "Your Majesty," she said, dropping into a clumsy bow, water sloshing onto her already wet skirts. "I didn't realize I'll leave right away, I'd just stay," Alaric said. It wasn't a request. He stared at her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel like he was reading something on her skin even she couldn't see. Then he turned to the guard. "Tell the healer his services aren't needed tonight." His eyes flicked back to Mira. "Your name?" "Mira," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Laundry, Your Majesty." "I shouldn't have what?" "Helped my nephew when no one else managed to stop the bleeding?" His tone wasn't harsh, but it wasn't soft either. Tired, maybe, or surprised. Theo, still on the bench, looked between them with the unguarded curiosity only kids manage. "She said I was braver than half the men she's met," he announced, holding his bandaged arm up like a trophy. A faint smile pulled at Alaric's mouth, gone as fast as it came. "Did she?" "Kids exaggerate," Mira said quickly, heat crawling up her neck. "I don't think he was." Alaric crossed the room, kneeling to inspect the bandage himself, his big hands surprisingly careful. "This is good work, clean, tight. Whoever taught you knew what they were doing." "My mother. She kept a small farm. We didn't always have coin for a healer, so she taught me herself." "Where's your mother now?" The question hit harder than she expected. "Passed 3 winters ago." Something flickered across his face, not quite sympathy, but close. "I'm sorry." "It's all right," she said, though it wasn't. Not really. It just was. A guard returned, and the room filled with the usual flurry that followed a crisis once it had passed someone fetching warm milk, another scolding the stable boys for leaving sharp tools where kids could reach them. Mira used the chaos as cover, eager to slip back into the obscurity she'd grown comfortable in. She made it to the door before his voice stopped her. "Mira." She turned. "Thank you," he said. Simple, direct, the kind of thank you that didn't ask for anything back, which somehow made it land heavier than gold would have. "Just doing what anyone would, Your Majesty." "No," he said. "Not anyone." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and slipped into the corridor before her face could give anything else away. By the time she got back, the sun had nearly set, and Hessa was waiting, arms crossed, questions sharp as knives. "Well, what happened? Why so long?" "There was a boy. Cut his arm." "I helped." Mira set the basin down, deliberately vague. "You helped." Hessa's eyebrows climbed. "Just helped, or helped in front of the king himself." Half the kitchen's already whispering. Mira's stomach. Word moved fast in this place. It was nothing. It's never nothing when it involves him, Hessa said, lowering her voice though no one else was around. "Be careful, girl. Men like that they can ruin a woman's life with one wrong look from the wrong person. I don't see why anyone would care about a servant handing him water," Mira said, though even as it left her mouth she wasn't sure she believed it. She didn't sleep well. She lay on her narrow cot, staring at cracked ceiling beams, replaying how Alaric had looked at her not with pity, not disgust, but something close to attention. Real attention. The kind nobody had aimed at her in years. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. By morning, she'd convinced herself it was a one-time thing, a strange little detour in an otherwise unremarkable life. Back to laundry, errands, dodging the cruel comments trailing her like a shadow she couldn't shake. But 3 days later, a guard found her in the courtyard, expression carefully blank in that way that always meant trouble. "You're wanted in the East Hall," he said. "King's orders." Mira's hand stilled on the basket. "Me? You're Mira? The laundry girl who treated Lord Theo's arm?" She nodded, throat dry. "Then, yes. You." The walk felt endless. Servants she passed stared, whispering behind their hands the moment she'd gone by. By the time she reached the East Hall, her palms were damp and her mind had run through a dozen terrible possibilities had Theo's wound gotten infected. Had she stepped out of line somewhere without knowing? The doors opened. There he stood by a long table covered in maps and reports, looking every bit the king the rumors painted. Broad shoulders, sharp jaw, eyes that missed nothing. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty?" Mira asked, bowing, clumsier than last time. "Theo's been asking for you, every day since you treated his arm. Says you're the only one who didn't talk to him like he was made of glass." That's kind of him to say. It isn't kindness, it's the truth. Alaric studied her, the silence stretching. "I have a proposition." Her heart dropped. "A proposition? The palace healer's old, overworked, and half the staff is scared of him. Theo's not the only child in this household who gets hurt and needs calm, quick hands. I want you in the infirmary. Officially, proper pay. Proper quarters." It wasn't what she'd expected. Relief and confusion tangled in her chest. "Why me?" "Because you didn't panic in that room," he said. "And because the way the staff talks about you doesn't match what I saw with my own eyes." Her cheeks burned. "You've heard the talk then, enough of it," he said, voice darkening slightly. "Barren, worthless. I don't think much of those words." She didn't know how to answer. No one, not Bren, not Hessa, not even her own mother in her final days, had ever pushed back against the labels the world had stitched onto her so thoroughly she'd half stopped noticing they were there. "You don't know me, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "You don't know if those words are true. I know a woman who can stitch a child's wound with steady hands while everyone else loses their mind isn't worthless. Whatever else is true or not." Mira swallowed, unsure what to do with the warmth spreading through her chest, unfamiliar and a little frightening. "I accept," she said finally. "Thank you." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close enough she felt it in her bones. Mira moved into the infirmary quarters the following week, and the change hit her harder than she expected. The room was small but clean, a real bed instead of a cot, a window that actually let light in instead of just cold air. She kept waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake, that they'd send her back the moment they realized what they'd done. No one did. Old Garrick, the palace healer, grumbled about having an assistant at first, muttering about young hands and impatience. But within days he'd handed her the task of restocking herbs, then mixing salves, then treating minor cuts and fevers on her own, while he napped in the back room more often than he probably should have. "You've got good instincts," he admitted one afternoon, watching her wrap a guard's sprained wrist. "Where'd a laundry girl learn all this?" "My mother. She treated half our village before she died." "Lucky for us, then," Garrick grunted, settling into his chair. Theo visited often, usually trailing some new scrape from whatever mischief he'd gotten into, though Mira suspected half his visits had nothing to do with injuries at all. He'd sit on the low bench chattering about lessons he hated and games he loved, and she found herself laughing more in those weeks than she had in years. Alaric came by too, not often, not in any way that drew attention, but enough that Mira started recognizing the rhythm of his footsteps before he even rounded the corner. He'd ask about Theo's recovery, linger a few minutes longer than necessary, ask questions that had nothing to do with medicine, what she thought of the new harvest taxes, whether she preferred the eastern gardens or the western ones. If she'd ever wanted to leave the kingdom and see somewhere new. "Why does it matter what I think?" she asked once, genuinely confused. "I'm not exactly the person whose opinion gets asked, Your Majesty." "Maybe it should be," he said, and didn't explain, leaving her staring after him long after he'd gone. The whispers followed her anyway. Some kitchen staff treated her with a strange, wary politeness, unsure whether to be kind or afraid. Others were crueler, more direct. Trying to climb out of the gutter, one laundrywoman sneered as Mira crossed the courtyard one morning. "Think a few bandages will make him forget you're barren? Useless to any man, that's what you are." Mira kept walking. The words landed exactly where they always did, deep and sharp, but this time they didn't sink quite as far. Maybe because for the first time in years, someone with real power had looked at her and seen something other than what she couldn't do. Weeks passed. The infirmary became less of a job and more of a place she actually belonged. Garrick trusted her with more each day. Theo treated her like an older sister, and Alaric kept coming. One evening he found her alone, mixing a tincture by candlelight, the rest of the infirmary dark and quiet. "You're up late," he said from the doorway. She startled, nearly tipping the bottle. "Fever's been going around the kitchen staff. Wanted this ready by morning." He stepped inside, watching her hands move with practiced precision. "Do you ever rest?" "Rest is for people who don't need the work," she said, then immediately regretted how bitter it sounded. Alaric didn't flinch. "You don't have to prove anything here, Mira, don't I?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Everyone's waiting for me to slip, to prove I'm exactly what they already think I am." "And what's that?" She set the bottle down, finally looking at him directly. Useless, broken, a waste of a place that could have gone to someone more deserving. His jaw tightened, something fierce flashing through his eyes. "Who said that to you?" "Everyone. My whole life. It doesn't matter who said it first. It's just true now." "It's not true." His voice came out rougher than before. "I've watched you for weeks. You're the most capable person in this palace, and most of them don't even know your name properly." Mira's throat tightened, tears she refused to let fall burning behind her eyes. "You don't understand what it's like. To be told the one thing your body was supposed to do, you can't do. To have your husband leave because of it. To have his family say it to your face at the market, in front of everyone." Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he said finally. "Everyone tells me I need a new one. An heir. A future for the kingdom. As if she was just a function I need to replace." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "So maybe I understand more than you think, being reduced to what you can or can't provide instead of who you are." Something in Mira's chest loosened, just slightly. "I'm sorry. About your wife." "I'm sorry about what they've put you through," he said back. They stood there in the candlelight, two people who'd both been measured and found lacking by people who never bothered to look closer. "Why do you keep coming here?" Mira asked quietly. "You're a king. You don't need to check on the infirmary every other evening." "I don't know," he admitted, and for the first time he sounded uncertain. "I just know I want to." He left shortly after that, without another word, and Mira stood alone in the candlelight for a long time. her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Kings were allowed to be kind. It was simply who he was, generous even to people who didn't deserve it. But the next morning, Garrick gave her a knowing look over his tea. "He's been by here more in the last month than he has in the last year," the old healer said, not looking up from his cup. "He's checking on Theo," Mira said quickly. "Theo's arm healed 2 weeks ago." Garrick took a slow sip. "You're a smart girl. Smart enough to know what I'm not saying." Mira didn't answer, busying herself with the herb cabinet instead, pretending the conversation hadn't unsettled her as much as it had. Days folded into weeks. The council, she heard through whispers carried on kitchen gossip, had grown more insistent. 3 noble daughters had been formally presented as potential matches: Lady Wren of the Northern House, known for her sharp political mind, Lady Ophelia from the coastal territories, famous for her beauty, and Lady Sable, whose family controlled most of the southern trade routes. All 3 came from bloodlines with proven fertility, generations of healthy heirs stretching back as far as anyone cared to trace. Mira tried not to think about it. It wasn't her business who the king chose to marry. It had never been her business, and nothing that had happened in the infirmary changed that fact. Except it was getting harder to convince herself of that with each passing day. She saw him almost daily now, sometimes for actual reasons: a guard with a fever, a hunting party returning with minor injuries, sometimes for no clear reason at all beyond him simply appearing in the doorway with that same searching look in his eyes. He'd ask about her day. He'd tell her, briefly, about the frustrations of council meetings, the exhausting weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. He never asked her opinion on the marriage candidates, and she never offered one, though the question sat heavy and unspoken between them every time the topic of the council came up. One afternoon, Theo burst into the infirmary, breathless and grinning, a wooden practice sword clutched in his hand. Mira, come see. Uncle Alaric's teaching me how to spar properly." She laughed, setting down the bandages she'd been folding. "Is that so? And did you win?" "No," Theo admitted, deflating slightly. "But I almost got him once." "Almost counts for something," she said, ruffling his hair. Alaric appeared in the doorway moments later, slightly out of breath, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking younger somehow than he did in council robes. "He's exaggerating. He didn't almost get me. I did too. You tripped and I caught you before you fell. That counts." Mira covered her laugh with her hand, and Alaric's eyes found hers across the room, something warm and unguarded passing between them before either of them could stop it. Theo, oblivious, was already rambling about wanting a real sword someday, but Mira barely heard him, caught entirely in the way Alaric was looking at her like she was the only other person in the room. "You should join us sometime," Alaric said suddenly. "Theo could use someone to root for him who isn't biased toward me winning. I don't think the king's mate to be sparring with a laundry girl would sit well with the council," Mira said, the words coming out sharper than she meant. Something shifted in Alaric's expression. "I haven't chosen anyone yet." "But you will." "Soon, everyone says so." He didn't answer right away, his jaw tightening in that way she'd come to recognize meant he was holding something back. "The council wants me to. That doesn't mean I want to. It's your duty, though, isn't it? An heir, a future." "My duty," he repeated almost bitterly, "has always come before what I want. I'm tired of pretending that's the same thing." Theo, sensing the shift in mood even without understanding it, tugged at Alaric's sleeve. "Can we go finish sparring? Please?" Alaric's expression softened immediately. "Of course." He glanced back at Mira before leaving. "Think about what I said. About joining us." She didn't answer, watching them disappear down the corridor together, Theo already chattering about some new move he wanted to learn. That night, lying awake in her small infirmary quarters, Mira allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine what it would be like if things were different. If she wasn't the woman the whole kingdom called barren and worthless. If she was someone whose name could sit comfortably beside his without scandal trailing in its wake. The thought scared her more than any insult ever had, because insults she'd learned to survive. Hope, she wasn't sure she could. The next morning, everything changed. A messenger arrived at dawn, breathless from riding through the night, carrying news that sent the entire palace into a frenzy. Lord Ragnar, leader of the neighboring Thornwood territory and longtime rival to the crown, had begun amassing forces along the eastern border. War, or at least the very real threat of it, was suddenly knocking at the kingdom's door. Mira watched from the infirmary window as guards rushed across the courtyard, as council members hurried toward the war room with grim faces, as the entire rhythm of the palace shifted from routine to urgency in the span of an hour. She didn't see Alaric for 3 days after that. When he finally appeared in the infirmary doorway again, he looked exhausted in a way she hadn't seen before, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders carrying a weight that seemed heavier than just physical tiredness. "You look like you need a healer more than anyone you've sent me this week," Mira said gently, guiding him toward a chair before he could protest. "I'm fine," he said, though the way he sank into the seat suggested otherwise. "You're not fine. You're running yourself into the ground." She fetched a cup of the calming tea Garrett kept brewed for exactly these moments and pressed it into his hands. "Drink," he obeyed without argument, which told her more about his state than any words could have. "The council's pressuring me to finalize my choice before any potential conflict escalates," he said after a long silence. "Apparently a married king with an heir on the way looks more stable to our enemies than one who's still unattached." Mira's chest tightened. "And have you decided?" He looked up at her, and the rawness in his eyes nearly stole the breath from her lungs. "I think I have," he said quietly. "I just don't know if she'd ever say yes." Mira's heart stuttered, but she forced herself to stay still, to not read too much into words that could mean anything. "Then ask her, whoever she is. I'm sure the council would be relieved." "The council would have my head," Alaric said, a humorless laugh escaping him. "She's not exactly what they have in mind for a queen." "Lady Wren, then?" "Or Sable?" Mira asked, hating how the question scraped against something raw in her chest. "Surely whoever you've chosen fits what they want." "No," he said, holding her gaze steadily now. "She doesn't fit what they want at all." Mira's breath caught. She told herself not to hope, not to read into the way he was looking at her, but her body wasn't listening to reason anymore. Alaric Agard burst into the infirmary before she could finish, breathless and urgent. "Your Majesty, the council's assembled. They need you immediately." Alaric's jaw tightened, the moment slipping away as quickly as it had arrived. He stood, lingering for just a second longer than necessary, his eyes searching hers like he wanted to say something more. "We'll talk," he said finally. "Soon." Then he was gone, leaving Mira standing alone amid the smell of herbs and the echo of words she wasn't sure she'd understood correctly. The war preparations consumed the palace over the following days. Soldiers drilled in the courtyard from dawn until dusk. Supply wagons rolled in and out constantly. The infirmary filled with minor injuries from training accidents, and Mira threw herself into the work, partly because the kingdom needed it, and partly because it gave her something to focus on besides the unfinished conversation sitting heavy in her chest. Rumors swirled through the palace faster than ever now. Some whispered the king had already chosen Lady Wren for her political connections, useful in wartime. Others insisted it would be Lady Sable, whose family's trade routes could fund an army. No one mentioned Mira's name, not seriously, not as anything more than the punchline to a cruel joke whispered between laundry women. She told herself that was fine. That was how it should be. A laundry girl turned infirmary assistant had no business being mentioned in the same breath as a queen, regardless of what may or may not have passed between her and the king in quiet moments no one else witnessed. Then, Lady Sable arrived at the palace formally 3 days before the War Council's final strategy meeting, and the entire dynamic shifted. She was beautiful in the way stories described queens' golden hair, sharp green eyes, a confidence that filled rooms before she even spoke. She also, Mira learned within the first hour of her arrival, had a particular fondness for cruelty disguised as charm. "You're the infirmary girl," Sable said, finding Mira restocking bandages in the storage room, her tone pleasant on the surface and venomous underneath. "The one everyone whispers about." "I help where I'm needed, my lady," Mira said carefully. "How sweet." Sable's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I hear you've been quite close with His Majesty, spending evenings alone with him in this little room of yours. He checks on his nephew's recovery. Nothing more, of course." Sable trailed a finger along the shelf, inspecting jars of herbs with feigned interest. It would be terribly embarrassing, wouldn't it, if people started believing a barren servant girl had ambitions above her station, especially once he's formally announced his choice. Mira's hands stilled on the bandages. "I have no ambitions, my lady. I know exactly what I am." "Good." Sable's smile sharpened. "Because the king needs an heir, and you, dear girl, are incapable of giving him one. Whatever fantasy you've built in that head of yours, it ends the moment he announces my name in front of the entire court." She left without waiting for a response, and Mira stood alone in the storage room for a long time afterward, the familiar weight of those old words pressing down on her chest with renewed force. Maybe Sable was right. Maybe whatever had passed between her and Alaric, whatever warmth had grown in stolen moments and quiet evenings, meant nothing in the face of what a kingdom actually needed. A queen who could give him an heir. A future. Things Mira's own body had already proven, painfully, it couldn't provide. She didn't see Alaric for 2 days after that, partly because the War Council consumed every hour of his time, and partly because she found reasons to keep herself buried in infirmary work, avoiding the moments their paths might cross. On the 3rd evening, exhausted from a day spent tending to a soldier's broken leg, Mira sat alone in the infirmary, finally allowing herself a few stolen tears she'd been holding back for days. She didn't hear him enter until his voice broke the silence. "Mira?" She wiped her face quickly, embarrassed, "Your Majesty. I didn't realize what's wrong." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling in front of her chair, his expression shifting instantly to concern. "Are you hurt? Did something happen?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice cracked on the word. "You're not fine." His hands found hers, warm and steady, grounding her in a way she desperately needed right now. "Tell me what happened." She hesitated, then the words spilled out before she could stop them. "Lady Sable came to see me. She made it very clear what I am, and what I'm not, and what the kingdom needs. She's not wrong, Alaric. I can't give you what a queen needs to give a king. I never could, with Tomas, and nothing's changed." Alaric's jaw tightened, fury flashing through his eyes that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with whatever Sable had said. "She had no right, she had every right," Mira interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "It's the truth. I've spent years being reminded of it. I don't need a noble lady to tell me something I already know. It's not the truth that matters to me," Alaric said fiercely, his hands tightening around hers. "I don't care about heirs the way the council does. I care about you, Mira. I have for weeks now, longer than I've let myself admit, even to myself." Her breath caught entirely. "Alaric, let me finish." His voice softened, though the intensity in his eyes didn't fade. "I watched you stitch my nephew's arm with steadier hands than half my soldiers manage in battle. I watched you work yourself to exhaustion treating people who've never once thanked you properly. I've watched the kingdom call you worthless while you quietly held more of this palace together than anyone realizes. I don't want Lady Sable. I don't want Lady Wren or Lady Ophelia. I want you, exactly as you are, heir or no heir, council's blessing or not." Tears spilled freely down Mira's face now, and she didn't bother stopping them. They'll never accept it. A king's queen who can't give him children, then they'll have to accept a king who'd rather have happiness than an heir born out of obligation, Alaric said firmly. "I've spent 2 years being told what I owe this kingdom. I'm done letting that decide everything I want for myself. Alaric, I am not asking you to decide tonight," he said gently, brushing a tear from her cheek with surprising tenderness. "I'm asking you to know that whatever happens with this council, whatever they push for, my choice has already been made. It's been you for weeks now." The War Council meeting arrived 3 days later, and the entire palace held its breath waiting for the outcome. Mira spent the morning unable to focus on anything, her hands fumbling with simple tasks she'd done 1,000 times before. Garrick noticed, but said nothing, simply handing her easier work and letting her sit by the window when her nerves got the better of her. The meeting stretched on for hours. By mid-afternoon, whispers began trickling through the palace. Alaric had stood before the entire council, including the 3 noble candidates and their families, and announced his decision. Not Lady Wren, not Lady Sable, not Lady Ophelia. Mira heard the news secondhand from a breathless kitchen maid who burst into the infirmary practically vibrating with excitement. "He chose someone outside the court entirely," the girl said, eyes wide. Council's in an uproar. Lady Sable stormed out before he even finished speaking. Mira's heart pounded, hope and terror warring violently in her chest. "Did they say who?" The maid shook her head. "No name yet. Just that it's someone from inside the palace. A commoner." Before Mira could process what that meant, a guard appeared at the infirmary door, the same careful blankness on his face that always preceded trouble. "Mira, you're needed in the throne room." Immediately, her legs felt like water as she followed him through corridors that suddenly seemed too long, too narrow, the weight of every stair from passing servants pressing down on her shoulders. By the time the throne room doors opened, her pulse was hammering so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The room was full. Council members lined the walls, expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Lady Wren and Lady Ophelia stood near the front, their faces carefully neutral. Though Mira caught the flicker of surprise in their eyes when they saw her enter, Lady Sable was nowhere in sight. And there, at the center of it all, stood Alaric, looking every bit the king his title demanded, but with eyes that softened the moment they found hers. "Mira," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Come forward." She did, though every step felt like wading through deep water, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against her skin. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, dropping into a bow once she reached the base of the throne. "I've informed the council of my decision," Alaric said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I intend to take you as my queen, if you'll have me." A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles, sharp and disbelieving. One council member, an older man with a permanently sour expression, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, with respect, this woman is a servant. Worse, she's known throughout the kingdom for her infertility. The throne needs an heir. The throne needs a ruler capable of making decisions for himself," Alaric interrupted, his voice sharpening into something dangerous. "I've spent 2 years listening to this council dictate who I should marry based on bloodlines and fertility charts, as if I'm breeding livestock rather than choosing a partner to share my life with." Your Majesty, the kingdom's future will be decided by good governance, strong alliances, and a stable leadership. None of which require a specific womb to secure, Alaric said firmly. If the council wishes to challenge my choice, you're welcome to bring it before the full assembly. But I assure you, my decision will not change. Silence fell across the room, heavy and uncertain. Mira stood frozen, barely able to believe what she was hearing, the words washing over her like something out of a dream she hadn't dared let herself have. Your Majesty, another council member finally said, more cautiously this time, if this is truly your wish, the council will of course respect it. Alaric's gaze returned to Mira, softening entirely now. It is my wish. More than anything I've wanted in a very long time. He stepped down from the throne, closing the distance between them, and knelt in front of her despite the gasps that rippled through the watching council. Mira, he said, taking her hands in his. I know what this kingdom has called you. I know what you've been told your whole life. None of it changes how I feel. I'm not asking you to be a queen who gives me an heir. I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal, the person I want beside me through everything this crown demands of me. Will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision, and for a long moment she couldn't find any words at all. The room waited, breathless, the entire weight of the kingdom seemingly balanced on her answer. Yes, she finally managed, the word breaking on a sob she didn't try to hide. Yes, I'll marry you. The room erupted into chaos, some cheers, mostly from the staff who'd quietly slipped in to watch, and sharp murmurs of disapproval from the nobility still processing what had just happened. Alaric didn't seem to care about any of it. He rose, pulling Mira into his arms, and kissed her right there in front of the entire court, sealing a promise that no council objection could undo. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation, tension, and quiet defiance against a court that wasn't ready to accept her. Lady Sable left the palace within days, taking her wounded pride and her father's trade alliance threats with her, though Alaric handled the political fallout with a calm steadiness that surprised even his own advisors. Theo, predictably, was thrilled. You're going to be my aunt, he announced gleefully, practically tackling Mira in the infirmary the day the engagement was formally announced. Does that mean you'll teach me more sparring tricks? I think your uncle handles the sparring lessons, Mira laughed, hugging him tightly. But I'll always patch you up when you lose. I don't lose, Theo said indignantly, and Mira laughed harder. Not everyone in the palace welcomed the news so warmly. Whispers followed her through every corridor, sharper now that her position had shifted from servant to soon-to-be queen. Some of the noble families openly questioned Alaric's judgment, worried about the stability of a crown without a guaranteed heir. Others simply couldn't accept that a woman once called barren and worthless now stood poised to wear the kingdom's crown. Mira heard every whisper. She felt every judgmental stare, but for the first time in years, the words didn't carve as deep, because beside her stood someone who'd chosen her not despite what she couldn't give, but because of everything she actually was. The wedding took place on a clear autumn morning, the kind of day that felt almost deliberately kind after months of tension and uncertainty. The grand hall had been transformed overnight, draped in deep blues and golds, the Voss family crest woven into every banner that hung from the rafters. Mira stood in a small antechamber, staring at her reflection in a mirror that had probably cost more than her entire childhood farm, hands trembling as Hessa fussed over the final adjustments to her gown. Stand still, girl, Hessa muttered, though her voice carried none of its usual sharpness. There was something softer in her tone now, something almost proud. You're going to ruin the hemline if you keep fidgeting. I can't help it, Mira admitted. What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if I say the wrong thing during the vows? What if you stop borrowing trouble that hasn't arrived yet? Hessa interrupted, though her hands were gentle as she smoothed the fabric at Mira's shoulders. You've survived worse than a wedding, child. You'll survive this too. Mira managed a shaky laugh. I suppose I have. The door opened, and Garrick stepped inside, looking unusually formal in robes Mira had never seen him wear before. They're ready for you, he said, then paused, studying her for a long moment. You look like a queen already. I don't feel like one, she admitted. No one does, the first time, Garrick said simply. Took me years to feel like a proper healer, even after the title was official. Feeling comes later. The doing comes first. His words settled something in her chest, steadying the nervous flutter that had been building all morning. She nodded, taking a deep breath, and let Hessa guide her toward the doors. The hall was packed when she stepped through, every noble family in the kingdom present, along with what felt like half the palace staff crowded near the back, faces she recognized from kitchens and stables and corridors she'd walked 1,000 times as someone entirely invisible to the people now watching her with rapt attention. And there, at the end of the long aisle, stood Alaric. He looked nothing like the exhausted, weight-burdened king she'd first treated months ago. His shoulders were straight, his eyes bright, and when they found hers across the room, the rest of the world seemed to fall away entirely. Mira walked the length of the aisle on legs that somehow remembered how to function despite her racing heart. Every step bringing her closer to a future she still couldn't quite believe was real. You look terrified, Alaric murmured when she finally reached him, a teasing warmth in his voice that eased the tension in her chest. I am terrified, she admitted quietly. This is a lot of people. Just focus on me, he said. Forget everyone else is even here. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and traditions Mira barely had time to process, her attention entirely consumed by the steady warmth of Alaric's hands holding hers, the unwavering certainty in his eyes as he spoke promises that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. When the priest finally pronounced them bound, sealed by both kingdom law and pack tradition, the hall erupted into applause, though Mira barely heard it over the pounding of her own heart. Alaric kissed her then, gentle and certain, and for one suspended moment, the weight of every cruel word she'd carried for years simply lifted away, replaced by something lighter, something that finally felt like it belonged to her. The feast that followed stretched long into the evening, course after course of food Mira had only ever served, never tasted, music filling the hall as nobles and servants alike celebrated the union in their own separate corners of acceptance and skepticism. Theo found her at one point, tugging at her sleeve with the same energy he always carried. Are you happy? He asked, surprisingly serious for a child his age. Very happy, Mira said, kneeling to his level. Are you? I get to keep you as my aunt forever now, he said matter-of-factly. So yes. She laughed, pulling him into a hug, and over his small shoulder, caught Alaric watching them both with an expression so full of warmth it nearly stole her breath. Later that night, after the feast had wound down and most of the guests had retired, Mira and Alaric stood alone on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, the cool autumn air settling comfortably around them. Any regrets? Alaric asked, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. None, Mira said honestly, though I imagine the council still has plenty. The council will adjust, Alaric said. They always do, eventually, and those who don't can find employment elsewhere. Mira smiled, leaning into his side. You've gotten quite ruthless about defending me, you know. I've always been ruthless, Alaric said. I just never had a reason worth using it for before. They stood there in silence for a long moment, watching the lanterns flicker across the courtyard below. the kingdom settling into the quiet rhythm of night. "Do you ever worry," Mira asked quietly, "that I won't be enough? That, without an heir, the kingdom will eventually stop?" Alaric said gently, turning her to face him fully. "I told you before, and I'll keep telling you for the rest of our lives if I have to. You are not defined by what you cannot give. You're defined by every single thing you've already given to Theo, to this palace, to me. That's enough. It's always been enough." Tears pricked at her eyes again, though this time they came from something entirely different than the years of pain she'd carried before. "I love you," she said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and right all at once. "I love you too," Alaric said, pressing his forehead against hers. "Barren or not, worthless or not, whatever names this kingdom tried to give you before I knew better, you're my queen now. And nothing about that is ever going to change." Below them, the kingdom continued its quiet evening rhythm, unaware that the woman once dismissed as worthless now stood at its very heart, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, finally exactly where she belonged. Months later, when whispers of an unexpected pregnancy reached the council's ears, the news spread through the kingdom faster than any war declaration ever had. But by then, it hardly mattered to either Mira or Alaric whether the rumors were true or not. They'd already built something far stronger than bloodlines or fertility, a partnership rooted in choice, in respect, in a love that had survived every cruel word the world had thrown at it. And whether an heir came or not, the kingdom had already learned its lesson. Their queen had never been worthless. She'd simply been waiting for someone willing to see her clearly. The months following the wedding settled into a rhythm Mira never could have imagined for herself a year earlier. Mornings began with breakfast on the private terrace overlooking the eastern gardens, something Alaric had insisted on once he realized how much she loved watching the sunrise paint the stone walls gold. Afternoons, more often than not, found her still in the infirmary, despite the gentle protests from several council members who felt a queen shouldn't be elbow-deep in herb mixtures and bandage rolls. "You don't have to keep working there," Alaric told her one evening, half amused, half concerned, as she came to dinner with the faint smell of lavender still clinging to her sleeves. "I know I don't have to," Mira said. "I want to. Garrick's getting older. Someone needs to keep training the new assistants properly. You could train them as queen, from a comfortable distance. I learn better with my hands in it. You know that." He didn't argue further, mostly because he'd already learned that arguing with Mira about her own choices rarely went anywhere productive, and partly because he understood, better than most, why she clung so fiercely to the one place that had first given her purpose beyond what the world had decided she was worth. The council, true to Alaric's prediction, slowly adjusted. Some members remained cold, formal in their interactions with her, clearly still resentful of a queen who hadn't come from noble blood. But others, surprisingly, came around faster than expected, particularly after Mira personally treated an outbreak of fever among the soldiers stationed near the eastern border, working alongside Garrick for 3 sleepless days until the worst of it passed. "You saved at least a dozen men who would have died waiting for a proper healer to arrive from the capital," one grizzled war general told her afterward, bowing with a respect that surprised her more than she let on. "The kingdom owes you a debt, Your Majesty." "I just did what anyone with training would have done," Mira said, though the words felt less heavy now than they once had, less like deflection, and more like simple truth. "Not everyone would have stayed 3 days without sleep for soldiers they'd never met," the general said. "Whatever the council whispers about bloodlines, you've earned your crown twice over." Word of moments like these spread slowly through the kingdom, chipping away at the old reputation that had followed her for years. She was still, occasionally, called barren in hushed conversations she wasn't meant to overhear. But increasingly, those words came paired with something else now capable. Devoted, the queen who treats soldiers with her own hands. Lady Sable's family, predictably, continued stirring resentment from a distance, sending sharp-tongued letters to sympathetic council members, questioning the stability of a throne without a clear heir. Alaric handled each one with the same calm dismissal he'd shown from the start, though Mira occasionally caught him reading particularly venomous letters late at night, jaw tight, before tossing them into the fire without comment. "You don't have to protect me from those," she told him one night, finding him by the hearth with another crumpled letter at his feet. "I'm not protecting you," he said. "I'm protecting myself from the urge to send a very pointed response that would likely start an unnecessary diplomatic incident." Mira laughed, settling into the chair beside him. "That bad?" "Worse," Alaric admitted, though a small smile tugged at his mouth despite himself. "Apparently Lord Sable is convinced our marriage is a personal insult to his daughter that he intends to remind the council of at every available opportunity. And what does the council say to that?" "Mostly they've grown tired of hearing it," Alaric said. "Which works in our favor, surprisingly." Theo, meanwhile, had taken to following Mira around the palace with increasing devotion, insisting she join every sparring lesson, every garden walk, every meal that didn't strictly require formal royal attendance. He'd grown taller in the months since his injury, the scar on his arm fading into a thin, pale line he proudly showed off to anyone who'd listen. "Mira gave me this scar," he announced to a visiting dignitary one afternoon, holding his arm up like a badge of honor. "Well, she fixed it. The scar's from falling off a fence, but she's the one who made sure my arm didn't fall off too." "I did not say your arm would fall off," Mira said, laughing despite the dignitary's startled expression. "You said it could get infected and they'd have to cut it off if I didn't keep it clean." "That's a slight exaggeration of what I actually said," Mira corrected, though she couldn't keep the smile from her face. The dignitary, an older woman from a neighboring kingdom, watched the exchange with obvious amusement. "Your queen has quite the bedside manner, Your Majesty," she remarked to Alaric. "She's the best healer this kingdom has ever had," Alaric said, pride unmistakable in his voice. "The crown is simply a secondary title at this point." As winter settled over the kingdom, bringing with it the usual flood of frostbitten fingers and persistent coughs that filled the infirmary, Mira noticed a change in herself she initially dismissed as nothing more than seasonal exhaustion. Fatigue that lingered longer than usual, a persistent queasiness in the mornings that she chalked up to something she'd eaten. Garrick noticed before she did, watching her more closely than usual over the course of a week, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "You've been tired," he said one morning, not quite a question. "It's winter," Mira said, dismissing the comment as she organized a fresh batch of cough remedies. "Everyone's tired in winter. You've also been sick the past 3 mornings." Mira paused, her hands stilling on the jars in front of her. "It's probably just something I ate." "For 3 mornings straight?" Garrick's tone carried a particular weight that made Mira's stomach tighten with something that felt dangerously close to hope, the kind of hope she'd long ago trained herself not to indulge in. "Garrick, don't," she said quietly. "Don't say what I think you're about to say." "I'm not saying anything," Garrick replied carefully. "I'm simply suggesting you might want to rest more than usual for the next few days. See how you feel." Mira didn't sleep well that night, her mind spinning through years of careful acceptance she'd built around her own body's supposed failures, years of being told, by healers and husbands and entire villages, that this particular kind of hope simply wasn't meant for her. She didn't tell Alaric, not yet, terrified of planting a seed of hope in him that might wither just as painfully as it always had in her. But the fatigue persisted. The morning sickness worsened. And 2 weeks later, when Garrick gently suggested a particular tea brewed specifically to confirm what both of them increasingly suspected, Mira found herself sitting alone in the infirmary's back room, staring at the evidence she'd never allowed herself to believe she'd see. She was pregnant. The realization hit her in waves, disbelief first, sharp and overwhelming, followed by a terror so consuming it nearly buckled her knees. What if something went wrong? What if her body, the one everyone had spent years calling broken, found some new way to fail her now, at the moment it mattered most? Garrick found her sitting frozen on the edge of a cot, staring blankly at the wall. "Mira? I don't understand," she whispered. "They told me. Everyone told me I couldn't. Tomas's family, the healers back home, even my own mother eventually started believing it. How is this possible?" "Bodies are strange things," Garrick said gently, settling beside her. "Sometimes the conditions simply weren't right before. Stress, poor nutrition during difficult years, an unsupportive environment. None of that means your body was ever truly broken. It might have just needed the right circumstances to finally work as it was always meant to." Tears spilled freely down Mira's face, an overwhelming mixture of joy and fear tangled too tightly together to separate. "You need to tell him," Garrick said softly. "What if I lose it?" Mira asked, voice breaking. "What if I tell him, and then something goes wrong, and he has to watch me fail at this too? Then he'll grieve with you. Exactly as any partner should," Garrick said, "but hiding this from him to protect yourself from disappointment isn't fair to either of you. He deserves to know." That evening, Mira found Alaric in his study, reviewing reports by candlelight, the same exhausted dedication she'd grown so familiar with over the past months etched across his face. "Alaric," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. He looked up immediately, something in her tone catching his attention. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I just need to tell you something, and I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever the outcome, I need you to not get your hopes up too high, because I can't bear it if Mira—" He stood, crossing the room quickly, concern etched across his features. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," she said finally, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric, Alaric's expression shifting through disbelief, shock, and something that looked dangerously close to overwhelming joy before he caught himself. "You're certain?" he asked, voice rough. Garrick confirmed it this morning. Alaric pulled her into his arms so suddenly she nearly lost her balance, his hands trembling slightly as they cradled her face. "Mira, please don't get too excited," she whispered, even as tears streamed down her own face. "I can't handle it if something goes wrong, and you've already let yourself hope for too much." "I don't care about the risks," Alaric said fiercely. "I care about you. Whatever happens, whatever the outcome, we face it together. Do you understand me?" Together, the following months tested Mira's resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. The pregnancy, while progressing steadily under Garrick's careful watch, brought with it a fresh wave of palace gossip, some genuinely excited. Others openly skeptical that a woman once branded barren could actually carry a child to term. "They'll believe it when they see the baby in your arms," Hessa told her bluntly one afternoon, helping adjust the increasingly loose gowns Mira needed as her pregnancy progressed. Not a moment before. "And if something happens before then?" Mira asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her every quiet moment since the news first broke. "Then, we'll deal with that if it happens," Hessa said firmly. "Borrowing grief from a future that hasn't arrived yet only steals joy from the present you're actually living in." Alaric, true to his word, remained steady through every wave of anxiety that gripped Mira during those months. He insisted on accompanying her to every examination Garrick performed, holding her hand through moments of fear she couldn't fully voice, celebrating small milestones with a quiet intensity that gradually, slowly, began chipping away at the deep-seated belief she'd carried for years that her body was fundamentally broken. The council, predictably, used the pregnancy as fresh ammunition for renewed debates about succession and legitimacy, some members openly questioning whether the child, if born healthy, would even be recognized as a true heir given Mira's commoner status. Alaric shut down each objection with the same firm resolve he'd shown from the very beginning. My child, born from my wife, regardless of her birth status, will be recognized as the rightful heir to this throne, he stated plainly during one particularly tense council session. Anyone who challenges that can bring their grievance before the full assembly, though I'd advise against it. No one did. As spring approached, bringing warmer weather and longer days, Mira's pregnancy progressed without complication, much to Garrick's quiet relief and the growing astonishment of court physicians who'd been called in for additional opinions, all of whom confirmed the same thing: the pregnancy was healthy, progressing exactly as it should. Theo, predictably, was beside himself with excitement. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" he asked Mira almost daily, pressing his ear against her growing belly whenever she'd allow it, listening intently as if he might somehow hear the answer himself. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Mira told him, laughing at his persistent enthusiasm. "I hope it's a boy. Then I can teach him sparring too. What if it's a girl? Then I'll teach her sparring," Theo said matter-of-factly. "Girls can be good fighters too. You're proof of that." Mira blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. "I'm not a fighter, Theo, you are too," he insisted. "You fought off everyone who said mean things about you for years. That's the bravest kind of fighting there is." The simple wisdom in his words settled something in her chest she hadn't realized still needed settling. A quiet validation from a child too young to understand the full weight of what he'd said, yet somehow understanding it perfectly anyway. The birth, when it finally came in early summer, arrived faster and more intensely than anyone had prepared for. Mira's labor began in the middle of the night, sharp and sudden, sending the entire palace into a frenzy of activity, as Garrick rushed to her side and Alaric, despite every council protocol suggesting otherwise, refused to leave the room for even a moment. "This isn't proper," one of the attending midwives protested weakly as Alaric gripped Mira's hand through another contraction. "Your Majesty, perhaps you should wait outside while I'm not leaving," Alaric said, voice leaving no room for argument. "Whatever happens in this room, I'm staying." Hours stretched long and difficult, Mira's exhaustion mounting with each contraction, fear creeping in at the edges despite Garrick's calm reassurances that everything was progressing exactly as it should. Alaric stayed beside her through every moment, his presence the one steady anchor she clung to as her body worked through pain she'd never fully prepared herself for. When the baby finally arrived, just as dawn broke over the eastern gardens, the room fell into a silence so complete Mira feared, for one terrifying heartbeat, that something had gone wrong. Then the baby cried, loud and furious and unmistakably alive, and the entire room erupted into relieved, exhausted celebration. "A girl," Garrick announced, voice thick with emotion as he placed the tiny, squirming bundle into Mira's trembling arms. A healthy, strong baby girl. Mira stared down at her daughter, tears streaming freely down her face, disbelief and overwhelming love crashing through her in waves too large to fully process. The tiny face, scrunched and red and absolutely perfect, blinked up at her with dark eyes that already seemed to carry some quiet curiosity about the world she'd just entered. "Hello," Mira whispered, voice breaking. "Hello, Little one? Alaric knelt beside the bed, his own eyes glistening as he reached out to gently touch his daughter's tiny hand. "She's perfect," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." "She has your eyes," Mira murmured. "She has your strength," Alaric said. "I can already tell." Word of the princess's birth spread through the kingdom within hours. Carried by messengers riding to every corner of the realm, bells ringing from the capital's highest towers in celebration that hadn't been heard since Alaric's own birth decades earlier. The skepticism that had followed Mira for years didn't vanish overnight, but it cracked, visibly, the moment the council was formally presented with proof that the throne now had a healthy, legitimate heir. Lady Sable's family, still nursing wounds from the rejected marriage, sent a stiffly formal letter of congratulations that fooled absolutely no one regarding its sincerity. Alaric read it once, laughed under his breath, and tossed it into the same fire that had consumed dozens of similar letters before it. "They're just upset they bet wrong," he told Mira, settling onto the bed beside her as she nursed their daughter in the soft afternoon light filtering through the nursery windows. "Bet wrong?" Mira repeated, amused despite her exhaustion. "Lord Sable was quite vocal, before the wedding, that our marriage would end in scandal and disappointment within the year. I believe he's struggling to reconcile that prediction with current events. Poor Lord Sable," Mira said dryly. "However will he cope?" Alaric laughed, leaning over to press a soft kiss against her temple. "He'll manage. Most people who underestimated you eventually do, once they realize how wrong they were." The naming ceremony took place 2 weeks later, a quieter affair than the wedding had been, though still attended by most of the kingdom's notable families, many of whom approached Mira now with a deference that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. They named her Lyra, after Alaric's mother, a quiet honor that brought tears to several older council members who remembered the previous queen fondly. Theo, predictably, declared himself the baby's official protector, taking the responsibility with such serious dedication that he insisted on sleeping outside the nursery door for the first 3 nights, much to everyone's amused exasperation. "She doesn't need protecting from anything inside the palace," Mira told him gently on the 4th night, finally convincing him to return to his own bed. "She's perfectly safe." "I know," Theo said, though he still glanced back toward the nursery with obvious reluctance. "I just want her to know I was always here. From the very beginning." The sentiment, simple and earnest, struck something deep in Mira's chest, a reminder of just how thoroughly her life had transformed from the isolated, dismissed existence she'd lived only a year before. As Lyra grew, the palace gradually settled into a new rhythm built around her presence, the sound of childish laughter echoing through corridors that had once felt cold and unwelcoming to Mira. The steady stream of visiting nobles eager to pay respects to the kingdom's young princess. The slow but undeniable shift in how the court spoke about its queen. Garrick, watching Mira balance motherhood with her continued infirmary work, often remarked that she'd somehow managed to become busier as queen than she'd ever been as a servant. "You could delegate more," he suggested one afternoon, watching her mix a salve with one hand while rocking Lyra's cradle with her foot. "I could," Mira agreed. "But I won't." Stubborn as ever. "I've earned the right to be stubborn," she said, smiling despite her exhaustion, "after everything it took to get here." The years that followed brought their own challenges, as all lives inevitably did. Political tensions with neighboring territories that required careful diplomacy, occasional whispers of dissent from council members still uncomfortable with a commoner queen. The ordinary struggles of raising a child while balancing the demands of ruling a kingdom. But through it all, the foundation Mira and Alaric had built together remained steady, unshaken by the same forces that had once threatened to keep them apart entirely. Lady Wren, surprisingly, became one of Mira's closest allies within the court, the two women bonding over shared frustrations with outdated traditions and a mutual respect that had formed slowly but genuinely over countless council sessions. Lady Ophelia eventually married a duke from a neighboring territory, sending warm letters occasionally that suggested no lingering resentment over the marriage that hadn't been hers. Lady Sable, true to her nature, never fully reconciled with the outcome, though her influence within the court diminished steadily as her family's political relevance waned over subsequent years, a slow but satisfying justice that neither Mira nor Alaric needed to actively pursue. Theo grew into adulthood under Alaric's careful guidance, eventually taking on responsibilities within the kingdom's military structure, though he never quite outgrew his devotion to the woman who'd first treated his injured arm all those years ago. "You changed everything," he told Mira once, years later, during a quiet evening conversation that had drifted unexpectedly into reflection, not just for yourself, for all of us, for how this kingdom thinks about what someone deserves. "I didn't do anything special," Mira said, though the old reflexive deflection carried less weight now than it once had. "I just refused to believe the worst things people said about me. That's special enough," Theo said simply. "Most people believe it eventually. You didn't." The final stretch of that first difficult year, looking back, had taught Mira something she hadn't fully understood until much later, that the cruelest labels people pressed onto her had never actually been true measurements of her worth. They'd simply been reflections of other people's fear, their need to categorize and dismiss anything that didn't fit neatly into expectations they'd already decided were unchangeable. She thought about this often, especially on quiet mornings when she watched Lyra toddle through the palace gardens, chasing butterflies with the same fierce determination her mother had once needed simply to survive each cruel whisper that followed her through marketplace crowds. Lyra would never know that particular kind of cruelty, Mira promised herself. Not if she had any say in how her daughter grew up understanding her own worth. Alaric found her there one such morning, watching Lyra stumble happily through a patch of wildflowers near the eastern wall, sunlight catching gold in the little girl's dark hair. "You're thinking too hard again," he said, settling beside her on the garden bench. "I can always tell." "Just remembering," Mira said quietly, "how different everything used to be. Good different, or bad different?" "Both, I think." She leaned into his side, the familiar warmth of him settling something restless in her chest. "I used to believe I'd spend my entire life being defined by the one thing I couldn't do. Now I can barely remember why that belief ever felt so absolute, because the people around you back then had no real understanding of your worth," Alaric said simply. "They measured you by the narrowest possible standard and called it truth. It was never truth. It was just smallness, dressed up as certainty." Mira smiled, watching Lyra finally catch a butterfly between cupped hands, her delighted laughter carrying across the garden. "She's never going to know what that kind of smallness feels like." "No," Alaric agreed. "She won't. Not while we're around to make sure of it." The kingdom, over subsequent years, slowly forgot the particular scandal of its commoner queen, the story softening into something closer to legend than Gossip the laundry girl who became queen, who proved an entire court wrong simply by being exactly who she'd always been, stubborn and capable, and unwilling to accept the smallest version of herself that others had tried to impose. Young girls throughout the kingdom, Mira occasionally heard through quiet reports from traveling merchants and visiting dignitaries, had begun telling each other the story like a kind of promise that worth wasn't something other people got to decide for you, that the cruelest labels rarely told the truth about anything except the limitations of whoever had spoken them. Mira never set out to become anyone's inspiration. She'd simply refused, day after exhausting day, to let other people's smallness define the shape of her own life. That refusal, quiet and stubborn and built one small act of defiance at a time, had eventually become something far larger than she'd ever intended. On the evening of Lyra's 3rd birthday, the entire palace gathered for a celebration that stretched long into the night. Music and laughter filling halls that had once felt impossibly cold and unwelcoming to a woman who'd arrived there as nothing more than a laundry girl carrying water and bandages. Alaric found Mira near the edge of the celebration, watching their daughter dance clumsily with Theo, now grown tall and broad-shouldered himself, indulging his young cousin with patient good humor. "Any regrets?" Alaric asked, echoing the same question he'd asked on their wedding night, years earlier. "None," Mira said, just as she had then, though the word carried a different weight now, deeper and more certain. "Not a single one. Even knowing everything it took to get here? The council, the whispers, Lady Sable's letters, all of it?" "Especially knowing all of that," Mira said, smiling up at him, because every difficult moment led exactly here. To this. To her. She nodded toward Lyra, still dancing, still laughing, utterly unaware of the long, difficult road that had made her existence possible. "I wouldn't trade any of it." Alaric pulled her close, pressing a soft kiss against her temple as the music swelled around them, the celebration continuing late into the night under a sky full of stars that had watched over this kingdom long before either of them had been born, and would continue watching long after they were gone. The woman once called barren and worthless had become something the kingdom would remember for generations, not despite what she couldn't give, but because of everything she'd given anyway. Stubbornly, fiercely, until an entire court had no choice but to recognize what had always been true. She had never been worthless. She had simply been waiting, patiently and painfully, for a world willing to finally see her clearly. And in the end, she'd found exactly that, standing in the heart of a kingdom that had once dismissed her, now calling her, without hesitation or doubt, their beloved queen.